robust answers so that you've got a lot to go on
Awesome.
later.
I never thought about it that way,
Yeah.
so that's a really interesting point to bring up.
Sure.
Yes. So when it came to designing the study, how did you determine the best method for collecting data that was on college students' mental health?
Sure. So COMM studies as a field, different than COMM, which you all are majoring in. COMM studies is a pretty varied discipline. We call it productively fragmented. There are a lot of different things that we study in it, human communication or COMM studies. Things like media and, there is some overlap in like that department over there in our department, but there's things like media and there's mass comm, but there's also things like interpersonal communication in our discipline and organizational communication. And so all of this to say, my little corner of the world is called instructional communication, which is how we study teaching and learning processes, because I can know a lot of stuff, and if you think about the things that you're an expert in, you might be an expert in that thing, but if you can't communicate it to me effectively, then you can't teach it to me. And if you think about the best teachers that you've ever had, I would wager a pretty good guess that they're probably really great communicators. And the bad teachers that you've had have probably been pretty poor communicators. Not as like a hard and fast rule. There's certainly exceptions to those rules. Good communicators can be bad teachers, and bad communicators can be good teachers. But, that's generally the way that it goes. So instructional communication as a field, that's what we study. And within instructional communication, there are just some best practices about how we conduct research, like collecting data at the end of a semester rather than the beginning, so that you've had time to experience things. We ask the typical method is that we ask students to report on the class that they were in most previously that's not the one that they're currently sitting in. So I believe that study we collected all the data in person. It was before the pandemic. And the reason that we do that is because even though I might not be, who's your professor right now in this class?
Dr. Dew.
Dr. Dew. So I might, I know Dr. Dew, but I don't know her super well. But if I go into her class and I say, tell me about the things that Dr. Dew does, even if it's anonymized data and confidential participation and all of this stuff, you might not be as willing to be as open and honest. Whereas if I say, tell me about the class that you were in most recently before Dr. Dew's, right? So maybe you're talking about, Dr. Cole or Professor McAlexander or whoever, right? And that way you're just sort of removed from it. So that's sort of the way that we came to the method. It's just a series of best practices. Yeah. Practices. Sorry.
We noticed that you chose to collect quantitative data over qualitative data. What influenced that decision?
Sure. So I like to collect quantitative data because, and confirmation is a really great example of this actually. If we know something quantitatively, we can apply that knowledge across samples, right? Whereas if we collect it qualitatively, there's depending on your sort of approach to that data, you might not be able to say like this data is going to reflect the truth in another sample. And confirmation is a really great example of this, because if you sort of like go back through, if you dig through that literature review and see the stuff about how we explicated and all that business, that data was actually collected in Kentucky. I worked at a school called Murray State University before I worked here. And we collected the qualitative data about how students do this confirming business there. And this is not a slide on Kentucky or where I worked before, but like one of the components of confirmation is acknowledgement. So telling a peer that they did something really good in class, like there's a great question that you asked, or that was really, what she said was really great. I'm gonna piggyback off that sort of stuff. In that data set in Kentucky, they have a really big pre-vet program and a vet tech program. I'm not kidding. Some of the stuff that showed up in the data was like, hey, you did a great job clipping those nails today. That doesn't show up at Cal State Fullerton, like as qualitative data. But the quantitative data, the scale development, that all happened here. And that data set from here reflects the qualitative data that we found in Kentucky. And so we treated that qualitative data very quantitatively. A qualitative person would look at how we treated that qualitative data and be like, gross. And I've had conversations with my colleagues about that. They're like, because I'll say that I do qualitative work, but I'm very quick to acknowledge that my qualitative work is always masquerading. It's like, is really masquerading. It's quantitative in disguise. Because I want to get to those capital T truths, as I call them when I teach research methods, things that we can apply across settings. So even though in that qualitative data set, we see something like, you did a great job clipping horses' nails, maybe that doesn't show up here, but we do see acknowledgement still work here. It still functions in globally the same way, maybe not specifically in the same way as that sample, but it does work the same way here.
It's a lot more objective.
It is more objective, yes. Yeah, that capital T truth, that's what I mean. It's like the same for everybody.
Yeah.
Okay, could you walk us through the steps you took to creating the Likert type scale statements for this study?
Ooh, yeah, how much time do we have? So that was a whole process. Creating valid measures as a social science researcher is pretty challenging because you want to make sure that they're valid. And when I talk about validity, I don't know how Dr. Drew does it, but when I talk about validity, I talk about hitting what you're aiming at. You want to make sure that you're getting that thing. If you're off, then that can be a really significant problem. So it's quite an involved process, but like with the quantitative measurement of student-to-student confirmation, we created an item pool, we collected data on that, we did a process on that called exploratory factor analysis, where we see how these items group together, and then we do a second, and in our case they asked us to do a third data collection, 2 more studies to confirm that factor structure or that dimensionality. So how did we create those statements? We sat around in our house and we worked on them for a while because, like I said, we're married. But I mean, it's that simple. But then there's all this extra stuff that comes after it to make sure that they're good. It's not just a case of writing 25 items and being done. I think our initial item pool was something like 80, and I've done another scale. I think I wrote around the same number, and I arrived at like 27 items. It's a different sort of thing, but it's involved, and it's, if you are the kind of person who gets into this stuff, it's interesting to look at how research has evolved and developed, because what used to pass muster or be acceptable like practice for creating a scale in even in the 2000s is now so lax and outdated that it would never fly now, but we still use some of those things because they're just sort of accepted in our little communities, and it's I got a whole soapbox. Yeah. My graduate students have to hear about it like literally every week, so